bit of a song just to get us kicked off, Nick. I am going to start recording now.
All right.
Welcome, everybody. It's so excited to have you in class today. Today's class is all about amending the Constitution. So you want to change the Constitution. We need to start with, how do you do that? How does it work? Why did they put that in there? All those questions. But when we were thinking about this and we were saying we need to really think about amending the Constitution, this song popped into my head. So real quick for all of us, and I only have 20 seconds. And the bridge.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for that UGG in the chat. So Amanda, now you can see again. So real quick, we just played a little introduction to David Bowie and changes. So changes are a part of our Constitution. They're a part of our life, and we need to know how the process works if we want to amend the Constitution. So my name is Kerry Sautner. Welcome to class today. I'm the Chief Learning Officer, and I'm going to be with you for class. But I'm also going to be with one of our top scholars, Nicholas Mosvick. So Nicholas, can you say hello to everybody and just kind of get us excited about the topic for today?
Hi, yes, I'm Nick, and I am one of our senior fellows in Constitutional Content. And what's to get excited about today? Well, it's to learn about a process that is rather important, because people are often thinking about changes that we can make, important major changes that we can make towards our system. And amending the Constitution is one of those processes that's built in to our framework that is not talked about nearly enough. And so I think that's why we should be excited, right? Because it's worth reminding people that, hey, by the way, we have a way of doing that that isn't simply what we typically think of, which is the president acting, Congress acting, or the courts acting.
So, and I think it's really important. I love that, Nick, and I am totally with you. And I love the use of the chat. Everybody's chatting around already. But let's get to some big ideas. And then I'm going to share what James already shared in the chat, because I thought it was a great way to kind of answer that first question. So number one, this is what we're going to go over today, gang, is so you want to change the Constitution. How do we do that? How did the founding fathers and the founding generation put those changes into the Constitution? Why did they put it into the Constitution? Real quick, and I'm dying to know, like, when have we changed the Constitution, and what were all the factors that made that change possible? Because the next question is, why did they make it so hard? And those things are kind of connected. It's not easy to change the Constitution. There's a reason they made it hard. But then on top of it, what are all the things that have to work together in our country to make a change possible? And then finally, what makes a viable change, a change that's really going to have impact and go? Like, what if our students are thinking about adding a 28th Amendment? What are some of the things they should be thinking of when writing it or proposing it? All of those pieces. And what James shared in the chat is a really interesting one. So James said, I would like an amendment that would make the executive branch be more accountable to Congress, such as a requirement to respond to subpoenas and a requirement to testify in a timely manner. So maybe some kind of strengthening of checks and balances and accountability between the branches. So all those things are great. Nick, where do you want to start? Do you want to jump into Article 5 and look at the Constitution and where it talks about the amendment process? And then we'll kind of walk students through how it works.
Yeah, sure. So I think maybe the first, well, we start with the text. We always start with the text, and there's a lot there. I don't think we have to read over that together, because we can sum it up pretty simply, right? As Kerry said, it is difficult, or at least it's arduous, because there are essentially two ways that one can amend the Constitution. One way is that Congress, with 2/3 of both houses, meaning the House and the Senate, both have to have 2/3 majorities, can propose amendments to the Constitution. When they do so, then they send them out to the states, much like the Constitution was sent out to the states for ratification, and the requirement was 3/4 of the states ratify. That's still true under Article 5, right? It's the same requirement from the states. The other option is that the states themselves can, if 3/4 of the state legislators agree independently to propose amendments to the Constitution then they can do so, right? And what they would do so, how they would do that was to have a convention, right? They would propose a convention. That's never happened before. It's been discussed. Many times we've had public campaigns to try to get the state legislators to come together, but that 3/4 requirement has made it so that we have yet to have one. And I always like to note that, of course, the first movement for another constitutional convention was immediate, because the anti-federalists in the states that most openly questioned the Constitution and nearly didn't ratify it, principally New York and Virginia, wanted to have a second convention because they wanted a Bill of Rights. They wanted to more greatly limit the powers of the federal government. They didn't get that movement because James Madison and others really didn't want that. But there was an effort even before the dust had really settled to try to have a second convention. So those are the two ways that the text gives us. I think it's worth thinking that both this is hard, but of course we'll talk about with the history. The framers were actually making it less hard than the previous Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which essentially made it impossible in practice because it required all 13 states unanimous consent in order to amend. And rather famously, with one amendment, I believe in 1784, 12 states had accepted it. There was one holdout. That was enough. So even 12 of the 13 states wasn't enough to get anything done. And that was a real problem, right? Because the articles were already weak the way they were, and it was impossible to essentially change them. You can also see from that amendment process, the old one, exactly why the framers thought meeting in secret and replacing the articles was necessary, because under the articles requirements, it was pretty hard to make not only a small change, but that larger change of a new constitution. Well, under that old process, that was pretty cumbersome. So what they're trying to do is to not make it impossible, but not make it so easy that the Constitution would change all the time, right? Because we're trying to secure this stable basis for the American Republic going forward. So you have to have that stability, but you also have to have the ability to change, right? So it's trying to figure out what the answer to that is. And of course, you're starting from unanimous, which is essentially impossible in practice.
So yeah, so I don't think I've ever heard anybody say it that way, Nick, and I like that you're framing it that way, that it was actually harder. Like, let's start there. So before we have the Constitution, we're living under Articles of Confederation, and we have to be unanimous. To add anything to the Constitution, to change it, everybody has to say yes. Can you imagine that? Like, I can't get my family to agree on what type of pizza we should order. Do you think we would ever agree on a major change to our governing document? Really hard. That's why they made it easier, but not so simple that it would be dangerous. So we've had 27 amendments to the Constitution, and we're going to walk through some of them in a minute. And students, keep putting in the chat what you think the 28th Amendment should be, or the 29th. But Nick, I think it would be really helpful if we looked at this process that is in Article 5 of the Constitution and kind of say, like, how would one do this? If the students say, Amanda said, I think they should raise the required amount of Congress meeting each year. Another one from Lauren was an amendment to outlaw packing the Supreme Court. Otherwise, the president has too much power over the judicial branch. So two really interesting ones. How would Lauren do that? If she wanted to be like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start with a proposal. Like, how stuff works this one for me? Like, walk us through what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way of thinking about this, right, is that they do typically start with, you have individuals or groups who propose these ideas, or they're kind of out there in the public discourse, we might say, right? I mean, when we talk about some of our historic examples, you're going to see times in which that was the case. The 19th Amendment is certainly an example of that, but that is where you have public pressure, right? You have ideas from either maybe academics, maybe journalists, but probably more often, right, people who are advocating for change, right? Groups or individuals who are putting it out there. Then you need one of two things, right? Either you need a member of Congress to submit this proposal so that they can get 2/3 of each House of Congress to approve it, or you need to have the states come together and put together a convention. As I mentioned, that hasn't happened yet. So the typical thing in the process is you're getting somebody in Congress to take this, right? And I'll note that amendments have also been proposed by Congress themselves, right? We can talk about the 25th Amendment. We can talk about Senator Bay from Indiana, who there was a committee. I forgot what the committee was called. It had a weird name, but essentially it was proposing changes. So he proposed amendments. One of them, he also proposed an Electoral College amendment, and I think the Equal Rights Amendment also came through his committee. But the 25th Amendment as well. So you saw that flurry of amendments in the 50s and 60s. Well, some of that had to do with the activity of Congress. In the case of the 22nd Amendment, President Truman was pushing for some of that, or I'm sorry, Truman pushed for the 25th Amendment in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, and then eventually got passed in the 1960s. The 22nd Amendment was an example of the party having an active role because the Republican Party was mad at FDR for running for 4 terms. It's quite simple story. So they reacted to it, right? So in other words, there are different ways to do it, right? There's political pressure often. It could come from the party, it could come from a leader, or it can come from below, because the 19th Amendment, I think, is clearly an example of it. But even the 18th Amendment, why did we have prohibition? Well, because there was a massive temperance movement in this country. I think that has something to do with larger social movements that also has something to do with where the proposals come from. And it's usually then it's acting on Congress and the states to take those 2 votes, right?
So as we go through, so amendments proposed, and then typically, just to recap, it goes to Congress, and it's 2/3 of the members of Congress. It has always been that way, kind of, but there's another option. And then it goes, what's the next step? So proposal, approval by Congress or the states, and then what happens next? So say it is, let's pick the court packing one. So, Lauren proposes it. She talks to a member of Congress. It goes through a committee. It gets proposed to Congress. Congress then says 2/3 say yes. It then goes to ratification. What happens in the ratification process?
Yeah, so as that suggests, right, one of 2 ways this can happen. Either the states can have a vote in their legislature, or they can have a ratifying convention. I think the more typical thing you see in modern history is the first. You see a simple vote in the state legislature, right? The ratifying convention seems a bit of a older trend, right? So it's more typical to just see the state legislature itself hold a vote to ratify, which, by the way, that's something we talk about with the ERA. That's what happened with Virginia, I think, this last year. So that's more typical, and that can take time, which is exactly why having sort of political pressure or public interest is important in getting amendments through, because you need to have 38 states say yes. And those 38 states are going to have votes at different times. They're going to have different debates. They're going to do it different ways. And therefore, you're going to need to have that discussion in the forefront, right? Because in other words, if the temperature goes down in some respects, right, and they take time, then it's less likely to get finished, right? Because when you think of the amendments that quickly got passed, it's because there was that interest, that need. We have to do this now, right?
And when that need's there, right now we need 38 states to vote yes, and then it becomes, at that 38 states, it becomes an amendment.
Right. In other words, what you're saying, right, is, and I think it's an important observation, is technically this is something that could happen in a week. If Congress and the states wanted to act quickly, an amendment process could happen quickly, but it typically doesn't. And that has something to do with political reality more than it has to do with the constitutional process itself, right?
Got it. And I want to go through what makes kind of the right mix of energy, because that's what you're really talking about. It has to have enough energy to be able to get through in enough time to be able to become an amendment typically. But I mean, we know there's one on the books that sat on the books for a really long time. So could you just tell a little bit of the story about the 27th Amendment?
Oh, I thought for a second I thought you were talking about the ERA. I was like, wow,
No,
okay,
no, no, no.
that did sit
We
on
can
the
talk
books
about the
for
ERA too, but 27th
almost 100
Amendment, I
years
think,
now.
is crazy story.
Right. The 27th Amendment was actually part of the initial Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights was actually 12 proposed amendments to the states. So Madison initially submitted 17 amendments to the Senate. We don't have any of the debates that the Senate conducted. We don't know why they eliminated certain parts of the Bill of Rights, why they changed them. But in any case, they voted on and agreed on 12, which were then submitted to the states in 1789 in September. It took over 2 years for those Bill of Rights to be ratified, what we call the Bill of Rights, but there's 10 of them, right? You know, your 10 Bill of Rights. What are the other 2? One of them still never got passed, and that had to do with the formula for proportioning the House of Representatives. We all often like to talk, if that got passed, there'd be thousands of members of the House. California would have, I don't even know how many members California would have, but it would be rather absurd. The point is, that was proposed in 1789 when that formula would have increased the membership of the House, but not in the terms they would in 2021. The other one had to do with the salaries of Congress, their ability to control their salaries. That was the 27th Amendment. Not enough states okayed it. So because the states had their different votes on the Bill of Rights, and some states accepted other amendments and rejected some. And there wasn't enough votes for the 27th Amendment. And a student in, I think, 1982 in Texas wrote about it for his college paper. He famously got a C on the paper. I think probably in part because there was a lack of familiarity. What is this weird esoteric subject you're talking about, this lost amendment? But then the public got notice of it. Members of Congress got notice of it and became a subject of interest. This amendment that never passed, and it led to a campaign to eventually accept the 27th Amendment 203 years after it was proposed in 1992. So
203 years, people.
203 years.
So I like to think about the process like this. So the Bill of Rights, which we all kind of think is really important, took 2 years to get ratified. And we remember each one of those amendments went through this process by itself. So we tend to think of it like a bundle, that we voted for the bundle. We didn't. We went through each one because, an example, 2 of them weren't done. And then 200, how many, 230, how many years did it take again? Next, say that number again.
203.
203.
203
so
years, yeah.
The first 10 amendments, 2 years. The 27th Amendment, 203 years. Now, a couple
I was going to say, worth noting the 14th Amendment, that was 2 years too. We can get to talking about that, but that one took a little bit because there was exception and rejection. There are states that changed their minds. I like to talk about that because there are states that didn't pass the 14th Amendment until modern history. We're talking about very recently that they ratified it, right?
Pretty sure it's Mississippi.
No, they are for the, I think the 13th Amendment. They're the last to do so because they had an accident in 1995. They didn't properly submit it to the archivist, the National Archivist. They had to redo it in 2013. They are the last state, the 13th Amendment. But that's not true on the 14th and 15th, I don't think. But in any case, it shows that ratification process goes on even after the amendments become part of the Constitution, because there's still some states that never signed on and only later do so.
And that's kind of cool too. Like you can jump on later if you haven't. And the 13th Amendment, just so we're all clear, is the ending of slavery in our country in the Constitution. So real quick clarifying question, and if I butcher your name, please, or get your name wrong, please let me know. Correct me, and I'll fix it. Sanam said, so for the 3/4 of the states, the ratification process, an amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Do they take into account the size of the state? So how does the size? Yeah. So the final vote, it doesn't really take into account the size of the states. So there's nothing like the Electoral College where you get more depending on how much population you have. It really doesn't. It's each state gets one vote, correct?
Yeah, and I think that to some extent, like the Electoral College, can be understood through the prism of the federalism system, which is to say that has to do with federalism not only being about the division of powers between the federal and state governments, but also about sort of representation and ensuring that the entire country geographically and interests and all those things are represented in these decisions, right? So here you would say, we don't want California to decide our amendment process. We want as many Americans as possible from a variety of places and backgrounds to have a say on what ultimately becomes part of the Constitution.
Got it. Now,
I
two
think
more.
so. That's
Yeah.
that's through the prism of federalism, to be clear, right? So I think it's important to see it that way. Is always remember the background things we talk about with federalism, separation of powers, all that. We like to talk about the background for a reason, because even when we look at something at different, then you can understand, oh, okay, so that's why they were thinking of the amendment process this way.
And this is exactly where this question comes from. So it's the minutes class, and I'm not sure which student asked this, but it's a great question. The question really is about a bill, and this is the amendment process, not a bill into a law. But I think I love the question because it gets at the same point that you were just talking about next. What happens with a bill if a president does not want to veto it or pocket veto it, but he does not want to allow it? So let's address what's the difference between a bill and an amendment, answer that question, and then go back to what you were just saying is, does the president have any role in the amendment process? So there's 4 questions for you to break down there.
Yeah, I think let's take the first one, because I already mentioned one historic precedent, which was President Truman. I found in 1948 speeches, and I think some later ones had addressed the problem of presidential secession and said, we need an amendment. And now it took much longer than his presidency to get to that. But President Truman was pushing for that. So it was in the public discussion. People were aware of this potential problem and this desire for constitutional amendment to deal with presidential secession. So there's that. The 13th Amendment, President Lincoln rather famously had a role in twisting arms in Congress, so to speak, to help get the passage, because it was very, very close. It required some Democrats and some people very much on the fence in the House of Representatives specifically to pass the 13th Amendment on January 30th, 1865. It was a very, very close vote. So certainly there was a role there. Of course, in the 14th and 15th Amendment, it's the opposite, because the 14th Amendment, because President Johnson was going around the country saying, don't pass this amendment. So there's also a role there. There's the president going, no, don't pass this. I disagree with this amendment. Well, we've seen that before. The 19th Amendment, rather famously, the suffragists picketed outside the White House. Alice Paul led the protests outside the White House in order to put pressure on President Wilson to support the 19th Amendment publicly, which he was eventually pushed into doing so. So presidents don't have a formal role, but they certainly have a role in terms of that leadership component, that public component of bringing it to people to put pressure on Congress and the states to pass amendments, right? So I think it's important to see it that way in terms of what presidents do. The veto question, that's a hard one, because essentially those are the president's options. The president can veto. They can pocket veto if the circumstances are right? A pocket veto only really works if Congress isn't in session, if they're in recess. Then you can pocket veto. But otherwise, you're sending it, if you don't veto it and you don't sign it, then the Congress is just going to resubmit it.
And I guess a thing, like going back, looking at bills separately than amendments, the president could use their same leverage that they have with amending the Constitution for the way or what's in the bill. So like, again, leaning in or saying don't, either like pushing hard or don't, and saying like, you know, the way you guys have it written right now, I'm going to veto that. Like we see that you can see that on the state level as well a lot. A governor saying to the state thing, don't put that in that law or else I'm going to veto it. And there's back and forth that goes on. So again, I just want to make sure we're separating how a bill becomes a law and their schoolhouse rocks.
No, I think that's important. Yeah, because the president plays more of a role in bills than amendments, because the president can't really say, don't put that in the amendment. because they have no formal role. I mean, what are they? What they can do is what Andrew Johnson did, is they can go on a speaking tour and say, I hate this amendment. But that's it. Well, it didn't work, although it did in some respects, right? Because if we could talk about, some states actually overturned their ratification, and it took over 2 years to ratify the 14th Amendment. And Johnson made it part of the election of 1866. Now, he lost on that respect because the Republicans gained seats in Congress in that election, which helped them continue to make their push for Reconstruction. But that's one of those fascinating things, is that states changed their minds and actually ended up rejecting after accepting or ratifying, which they can do, which is an important thing to note. And so the president can do that, but they can't lobby quite the same way they can with a bill. Because with a bill, they have that veto. They can say,
yep,
this is going to sit on my desk for 10 days. The pocket veto, the point of that is, I'm going to sit on this. And I'm going to put the pressure on you, Congress, right? That's what the pocket veto is doing, that as much as anything else, right? Is putting the pressure on the lawmakers. The veto, the pressure is, you need 2/3 to override me. Do you have 2/3 to override me, right? The president has no such threat available in the amendment process, because the only real threat is, I publicly can go out and make sure you don't get enough states to say yes to this, right? Because it's especially there, right? Because if Congress has the will, Congress has the will. But when it gets to the states, as I mentioned, typically we see it take some time, unless there's enough pressure and energy behind it. And that's an opportunity, if a president didn't like something, to push back against it. But again, history usually doesn't bear out that it's usually like Andrew Johnson. It's more the opposite, that the president has been pushed in alignment with these changes. And therefore, when you get an amendment, it's because most people in government are on board with the amendment.
Okay, cool. One clarifying question, then one kind of area that I want you to talk about, and then we're going to end with Riley's really good comment from earlier. So Iman asked an awesome question to clarify for everybody. Is it 2/3 of Congress? Does that mean 2/3 of the entire group as a whole, or 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate? So just to clarify that graphic.
Yeah, we're talking about both houses. It means that the House of Representatives and the Senate, you need 2/3 of each. So you can have a joint. Separate. Yeah, you can have a joint session. You can have, which usually, if you're going to make an amendment, you're probably going to have a joint committee, which means that the House and Senate members come together into a single committee. You'll have joint bodies to do that, but you need 2/3 of each body still to agree to it. So they work together on amendments typically because they both have to okay it, and they both have an interest in it. But that's what we mean by that language. And it's worth noting at the same time, I think I may have accidentally said 3/4 of states before. We're clarifying it's 2/3 of states, but it's still a high mark if the states want to act by themselves. And we still haven't seen it. I think part of that, my understanding has always been that states haven't gotten enough momentum to have their own convention, in part because a lot of people, when this idea gets brought up, says they're worried about what we would call a runaway convention, meaning that they'd start with one change they wanted and we'd end up with 20.
Got it.
Then,
yeah.
Yeah. It would exactly a rolling log. You can't stop it. Now the Constitution looks radically different, and we're all appalled. That's the worry.
It turns into the Ratatouille amendment, is what I
exactly.
say. You just keep adding stuff to it.
So no one wants to do that. They want to do one at a time. That's where that comes down to. Is 2/3 of states could do this, but people get nervous because they prefer to go one at a time. They don't like this thing where suddenly we would end up with 25 proposals, and one of them might be animals in the classroom. I don't know.
Yeah. Again, I'm cool with pets in the classroom. Okay, real quick though, because when we talked earlier about federalism, we always bring our classes back to these big ideas. And
yes,
a key thing and why we show Lincoln here, it really starts with this idea of popular sovereignty.
Yes.
That there has to be perfect storm going on to make even the ones that take 2 years work and to get through. So there's a lot of events, and it starts with we, the people, coming up with the proposed ideas, having energy around it, And people, it's an entire system. So the president can have agency and maybe voice, but not in the process logistically. But kind of walk us through when amendments have taken hold. Like I think about the 26th Amendment and how quickly that's one of the fastest, if I'm remembering it correctly, 18 to vote was one of the quickest to get turned. So walk us through this and give us a little bit about that amendment, because I know there's a lot going on in our country at that time that helped make that amendment go through so quickly. And when I say so quickly, I think it was like a year and a half.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the popular sovereignty point is a really good one, because I talked about how federalism is an important background. I mean, popular sovereignty is too, because we have to remember, as I noted, the 3/4 requirement is much like the one that was given for ratifying the Constitution itself. What was the basis for that? Popular sovereignty. We, the people, ultimately okay this Constitution. We also think that we, the people, ultimately okay any changes to the Constitution, right? Because they're the ultimate source of power. Does that make sense? Right. So that's still that big principle behind everything. And it means, Congress can't just change the Constitution. The people themselves have to okay those big changes, right? So we call that fundamental law. All that is to say is the fundamental principle is that we, the people, rule. So with the Civil War, I mean, yeah, Lincoln, it is important to even mention for him that popular sovereignty was a key principle that he believed in and frequently talked about, which is one of the reasons for invoking the Declaration of Independence as much as the Constitution, is that popular sovereignty and the very principles of our government itself, right? Why we have a government is important, right? So we think about that, and then we take that concept and we bring it to amending the Constitution, because we're doing so, as we often say with the Reconstruction amendments, to fit our system more with those ideas of equality for all, right? In other words, we're bringing up the system closer to getting to the very purposes for our foundation, right? So all men are created equal, right? That idea, right? So I think that's important for thinking of the Civil War. In terms of what happens with the 26th Amendment, I mean, we're talking about the Vietnam War. That's usually, I think the context is that men who were drafted into the Vietnam War could be at 18. So the registration for the draft started at 18, but of course you couldn't vote till you were 21. So the push fundamentally was, if people can go die in a foreign war, why can they not have a say in representative government? That seems like a real issue. And I think it's worth noting that that's not entirely dissimilar from the feelings of Black veterans after the Civil War or after World War I and World War II, right? And just in terms of when people participate in the most consequential struggles for their nation, they tend to believe that they have a greater say in representative government. That's not surprising.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of energy around that. Like, if I have to be drafted and fight for my country, I should be able to at least pick who does that, who declares that
Right.
I am going to war. Like, it's kind of, so a lot
but you can see how that makes sense, right? Is
yeah, and all these pieces fit together. Now the students are kind of, and this is back to Riley's final question, and we're going to wrap up in a minute, students. Great questions today. I love them. One quick clarifying question, and then we'll get to Riley and Satnam's question that are connected. So the clarifying question is, how does it even decide if that amendment is voted on by Congress? Like, that proposal, all these pieces have to work together to get that proposal enough energy to know that Congress is going to possibly do something with it. Is that correct? And to clarify that answer, how do they even know it gets to that point?
I mean, in terms of they have to schedule a vote. Is that what you mean? Or typically they're going to go through committee too, right? As the committees are going to mark these up, they're going to change it. They're going to end with text that everyone can live with, and I think will pass. I mean, we talk about this with, for instance, the 15th Amendment. Why did we end up with a more limited 15th Amendment than some of the proposals that had universal language that would have covered poll taxes, maybe even women voting? And it's because they had a joint committee. They couldn't agree on the language, and they ended up with the negative, shorter language in the 15th Amendment now, because they ran out of time and they needed to get a proposal they could all live with. So it has something to do with that process, right? And you think of the 14th Amendment. We talk about John Bingham as being the big force behind it, but he's not the only one. Certainly others had a hand in Lyman Trumbull, for instance, and Jacob Howard and others. So it's one of those things, right? The 13th Amendment, Trumbull's the one who drafts it, but of course other people have voices in it. The Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, but he was edited.
Oh, big time. And
He
the
was
best thing
edited,
to ever
right?
see is all of his edits. Like, they
Right.
tore him up. So
Yes.
like, don't ever feel bad. Like, if you get a lot of red pens,
He
got
definitely
a
felt
lot
bad.
of comments. Yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
So I think a part of this is a very, like, when we put these graphics up, it's a very simplistic, logistical way to do it. But there's a lot of conversations and a lot of dialogue and a lot of committee work and a lot of like discussions going on.
There should be like a 1B and C there, basically in between. It should be much longer to get to the approval and ratification, because that is what takes time. A lot of it is, okay, well, what is text we can live with? We all agree there's a problem, right? Because the proposal is kind of saying, do we agree there's a problem we should have an amendment about? Okay, enough people think that, yes, we should have an amendment. Now we need to have a text that we think that 2/3 of Congress, that 3/4 of the states can live with. What's that going to be? Well,
and then they work it out.
And I think sometimes that answers why we get the text we do, not only the 15th and 19th, but say the 18th and 21st Amendments. Why do you get kind of shorter, more basic kind of legalese? I think it's because it's, well, let's write something that's doesn't go too far, that we know is going to get passed. That's part of it. It's like the 26th Amendment is just dealing with that issue. It's age discrimination is what it's about, but that's it. It's very short. Just we're dealing with that. The 25th Amendment,
and cleaner.
Yeah, the 25th Amendment is like an exception to that because it's complicated.
Well, Madison.
Very complicated.
So let's go. Our final question, and this is Sona also asked kind of this point. Riley's point in the chat, which I really liked, was I think a good amendment would be any president or Congress cannot change the Constitution or end the Bill of Rights and modify it. So this is what I love, because this steps us back and really asks the question, what does the courts have to do with amendments? And how does the courts ensure that the president's actions and Congress, the laws that they make, can't mess with the amendments and can't mess with the Constitution? So when you think about that, Riley, that's almost the job of the court, is to do that, is to say that the president nor Congress cannot step on the Constitution. Nick kind of breaks that down, and that was the other question: is what do the courts have to do with this process too?
I'm trying to think of exactly. So the question is, what do the courts have to do with the amendments?
The question is, how does the courts kind of play a role in this process? And it's really about
one interesting worth noting
true.
is that after the 19th Amendment, there were multiple suits trying to essentially dispute that it allowed women to vote, and the Supreme Court, I think in more than one case, essentially said, "Oh, this is." I mean, you might summarize it as, "This is ridiculous." I don't know what you're talking about. The court is not, in other words, the court is not going to overturn an amendment. And they're not going to overturn the results of what the people decide. Think of it that way, right? If somebody brings the lawsuit and says, well, the amendment couldn't have really meant to allow women to vote, right? And the answer being, well, no, that's what the amendment said, and the people ratified it. So what do you want us to do? The court has no role in that, right? They have a role in interpreting what those amendments mean, because when we think about what the court's done in the 20th century, 21st century, a lot of what we're talking about at this point is the Bill of Rights or beyond, right? We're talking about amendments. We're not off. First Amendment, certainly, right? But you're talking about amendments still, right? It's the First Amendment. You're talking about freedom of speech. You're talking about amendment. So we're often talking about amendments. Yes, we talk about the structural constitution. We talk about Article 2, but a lot of times, a lot of our focus is on the 14th Amendment, on the First Amendment. We're talking about these core amendments to the Constitution, and it's interpreting what the text means, what the people were ratifying, what they thought it meant to them. It's those kinds of questions, right? But I think it actually highlights the tension, right? Which is to say, like, this is actually the core tension of judicial supremacy, if people believe in it, or even judicial review, is to what extent is the court upholding the people's will as opposed to overruling the people's will, which is the very tension within the system that makes that process both important, but then at times also controversial.
So I kind of find this fascinating. Like, this process that we're looking at here is almost like the center of the nucleus of the cell. And then the president and the courts are kind of out there. So like almost like Saturn. I'll use Saturn instead. So Saturn, this is like the core of Saturn. And then the moons orbiting are the president and the law and the courts. But we could almost sneak the courts in back here at the end of the process. So after it goes through and becomes a part of the supreme law of the land, don't think of it like a bill that becomes a law. It's an amendment that becomes a part of the constitutional law. Then you have the court saying, okay, now it's our job. Let's define it and let's enforce it. And then it goes back to, are they doing the will of the people through this process? So I think all this is connected. I'm using a lot of science analogy today because it keeps reminding me of the food.
Is the court like Pluto, not really a planet?
No, it's more like the food web. There's all these, there's things that are directly connected and things that are tangentially connected. So it's really fascinating system, and it is really complicated, but we're trying to break it down in a way you can see the structural process and understand that there's a lot of different levers to pull along the way. And with that, we are 10 minutes over. So thank you, students, for staying with us along this path. Thank you for thinking of amendments that you want to propose. And we will see you next time in class, and keep sending us. Love to see more of your amendments. So shoot them to us in an email. You have my email. I'd love to see them. Send them our way. We want to hear them from everywhere, from make animals in all classrooms to what was the Madison's great amendment today, which was no homework on Friday rule. All these things to the ERA amendment.
So what you're really talking about is the 4-day work week. That adults would pass the 4-day work week.
All like that. I love that, gang.
In that text, that might be a bit, we'll see.
I'm going to put my email in there right now, but I love the 4-day work week, but sorry, that now you got me excited about that one. And it's for kids as well, everybody. Thank you, guys. Great day. Thank you, Nick. I'm going to stop the recording now. So here's the official announcement of the stopping.